On a quiet October afternoon in Newport, Rhode Island, a man is found dead beneath the wheels of a car, pinned against the wrought iron gates of one of America's grandest estates. The woman driving that car is the richest woman in the world. She tells police it was an accident, that she meant to inch the car forward, that her foot slipped from the brake to the gas. The police believe her. The investigation lasts only days. The medical examiner who signs off on the case is, within hours of the death, hired as her personal physician. The man's family sues. They win. But the settlement is quietly reduced, and what remains is divided 11 ways among siblings who will spend the rest of their lives wondering what really happened on that gravel drive. For more than 50 years, the official story holds. A tragic accident, nothing more. Then, decades later, a journalist goes looking for the original police file and finds that it has vanished. The transcripts of the lawsuit are missing too. What he eventually pieces together suggests something far darker than an accident. Tire marks that don't match her account, injuries that don't match her story. A doctor who switched sides before the body was even cold. She gave millions to that town in the years that followed. Hospitals, historic preservation, charitable foundations bearing her name, doing genuine good for generations to come. And the people of Newport still whisper, to this day, that some of that money was never charity at all. It was blood money. This is the story of Doris Duke. To understand what Doris Duke became, you have to first understand what she was given and what she was never given at all. She was born on November 22, 1912, in New York City, the only child of James Buchanan Duke and his second wife, Nanalyn Holt Inman. Her father was not merely wealthy. He was one of the architects of modern American industry. The man who built the American Tobacco Company into a monopoly so dominant it would later be broken up by the federal government, and who used the fortune it generated to electrify the Carolinas through Duke power. He gave his name and $40 million to a small Methodist college in North Carolina that would be renamed in his honor, Duke University. When James Buchanan Duke died in 1925, Doris was 12 years old. The scale of what she inherited is difficult to translate into modern terms, but the attempt is worth making. His estate was valued at somewhere between $60 and $100 million. In today's money, over $1 billion. The majority of it passed to his wife and his daughter. Newspapers, with the bluntness of the era, began calling her the richest girl in the world. She would carry that title in one form or another for the rest of her life. She spent her early childhood at Duke Farms, her father's 2,700-acre estate in Hillsborough Township, New Jersey, a property so vast it functioned less like a backyard and more like a private kingdom. There were lakes. There were follies. There was, eventually, an indoor botanical garden that would grow to 60,000 square feet, among the largest in the country. But scale is not the same as warmth. Doris's mother, Nanalyn, was a shrewd, formidable woman, often compared by contemporaries to the legendarily ruthless financier Hetty Green, sometimes called the Witch of Wall Street. She was not, by most accounts, a particularly affectionate mother. The household Doris grew up in was one of immense material comfort and considerable emotional distance. Tutors rather than playmates, formality rather than intimacy, a girl who stood 6 feet tall by adolescence, towering over the adults meant to be raising her. In 1927, 2 years after her father's death, 12-year-old Doris did something that would define the rest of her life before it had properly begun. She sued her own mother. The lawsuit centered on ambiguous language in her father's will, language that her mother and the estate's executors were interpreting in a way that would have allowed them to sell off pieces of real estate Doris believed she was meant to inherit intact, including a mansion at 1 East 78th Street in Manhattan. The 12-year-old one. Think about what that means. At an age when most children are worrying about school and friendships, Doris Duke had already learned the central lesson of her life. That money does not protect you from the people closest to you. Sometimes it is the very thing that turns them against you. And the only defense available to her, even at 12, was to fight. She would spend the rest of her life as a woman who knew, with absolute certainty, that she could trust almost no one completely. It made her generous in extraordinary, sweeping ways. It also, as we will see, may have made her dangerous when she felt betrayed. When Doris Duke turned 18, In 1930, she was formally presented to society as a debutante at a lavish ball held at Rough Point, the 49-room English manor-style mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, that her family had owned for decades. She stood 6 feet tall, striking and unconventional, utterly unlike the demure debutantes the society pages expected. The press could not get enough of her. She received enormous bequests from her father's trust at 21, 25, and 30, some so large that the world's richest girl was no longer a nickname so much as a simple statement of fact. What did the richest girl in the world do with limitless time and limitless money? She did, it turns out, almost everything. She studied opera singing in New York under Estelle Liebling, the same teacher who trained Beverly Sills. During the Second World War, she worked in a Red Cross canteen for sailors stationed in Egypt, taking a token salary of $1 a year. A gesture that suggests a woman who, despite everything, wanted at some level to be useful rather than merely decorative. In 1945, she became a foreign correspondent for the International News Service, filing dispatches from across a Europe still smoldering from war. She spoke fluent French. She moved to Paris afterward and wrote for Harper's Bazaar. In Hawaii, she became the first non-native woman to compete seriously in surfing, trained personally by the legendary Duke Kahanamoku and his brothers, a sport that, in the 1930s, was about as far from East Coast high society as it was possible to travel. She kept pet camels. She played jazz piano with genuine skill and befriended musicians who had no idea, until they checked, that the woman sitting in on their sessions was worth tens of millions of dollars. She married for the first time in 1935 to James H.R. Cromwell, stepson of the financier Edward T. Stotesbury. Cromwell was a New Deal Democrat with political ambitions, and Doris, ever willing to fund the causes and the people she believed in, bankrolled his career. He served briefly as U.S. ambassador to Canada and made an unsuccessful run for the Senate. In 1940, the couple had a daughter, Arden, born prematurely in Honolulu. Arden died the following day. The marriage did not survive much longer. Doris and Cromwell divorced in 1943. It is worth pausing on the loss of Arden, because it is the kind of detailed documentaries often rush past on their way to the next glamorous chapter, and because grief, deferred and unprocessed, tends to resurface in places its owner does not expect. She would not have another biological child. Decades later, at the age of 75, she would attempt, in a manner so unusual it startled even those who knew her best, to manufacture a replacement. But that is later. In 1947, in Paris, Doris married for the second and final time to Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat as famous for his romantic conquests as for his diplomatic credentials. To clear the way, she reportedly paid his second wife, the actress Danielle Daria, $1 million to agree to an uncontested divorce. The marriage to Rubirosa was so significant in scale and visibility that the U.S. State Department itself took an interest, cautioning Duke against using her fortune to influence foreign policy and quietly worrying about what kind of leverage a foreign government might gain were she to die while married to one of its diplomats. A prenuptial agreement was required. Even so, during their brief marriage, Duke showered Rubirosa with gifts that read now like inventory from a fever dream. A stable of polo ponies, sports cars, a converted B-25 bomber. When they divorced in October 1948, just over a year after marrying, the settlement included a 17th-century house in Paris. She never married again. By her mid-30s, Doris Duke had built a life of dazzling, restless acquisition. Homes, lovers, causes, art, gardens, animals, entire identities tried on and discarded. She built Shangri-La in Honolulu, a stunning estate steeped in Islamic art and architecture that she filled, piece by piece, with treasures gathered across decades of international travel. She bought Falcon Lair in Los Angeles, once the home of silent film legend Rudolph Valentino. She purchased her own Boeing 737 and had its interior redesigned to include a bedroom that looked, improbably, like a bedroom in an actual house. A private jet built not to impress, but to make the endless movement between mansions feel something like home. She loved Newport above all. Each summer she returned to Rough Point, working hands-on, often alongside her own staff, on the restoration projects that would eventually become her signature philanthropic legacy. By every visible measure, Doris Duke was living the life her fortune had promised her. Adventurous, generous, eccentric in the specific, forgivable way that only the truly wealthy are permitted to be eccentric. And then, in the autumn of 1966, something happened at the gates of Rough Point that would cast a shadow over every philanthropic gesture she made for the rest of her life. His name was Eduardo Tyerla. For nearly a decade, he had served as the curator of Doris Duke's art holdings, a trusted figure inside the carefully guarded perimeter of her private world, the kind of person who, like Huguette Clark's nurse or Doris's own mother before him, occupied that dangerous middle ground between employee and intimate. In the autumn of 1966, Tyerla decided to leave. He wanted a career in Hollywood as a production designer, a chance, finally, to build something that bore his own name rather than curate someone else's collection. On October 6th, he flew to Newport, where Duke was staying at Rough Point, intending to collect his belongings and tell her in person that he was leaving her employ. His friends, people who also knew Duke, warned him she would not take it well. The following afternoon, staff at the estate overheard the two of them in a loud, lengthy argument. Afterward, they got into a rented Dodge Polara to leave the property together. What happened next has two versions. In Doris Duke's account, the one accepted by police, repeated in her obituaries, and treated as settled fact for more than 50 years. Tyerla, who had been driving, stepped out at the estate's gates to open them by hand, leaving the engine running with the parking brake engaged and the car in park. Duke, she said, moved from the passenger seat into the driver's seat, intending to ease the car forward once the gates swung open so she could collect him on the other side. In doing so, she released the parking brake and shifted into drive, but instead of finding the brake pedal with her foot, she found the gas. The car surged forward. It struck Tyerla, pinned him against the still-opening gates, knocked the gates from their hinges, and came to rest against a tree. He was found trapped beneath the vehicle on Bellevue Avenue. He was pronounced dead from his injuries. The Newport police investigated briefly and ruled the death accidental. This is where, for half a century, the story ended. The investigation into Eduardo Tyerla's death lasted only days, and even at the time, there were people in Newport who quietly believed it had been compromised from the start. Shortly before the medical examiner arrived at the hospital to formally examine the cause of death, Doris Duke hired him as her personal physician. Read that again. The man whose job it was to independently assess the circumstances of Tyerla's death became, in the same window of hours, financially and professionally bound to the woman whose actions he was meant to be evaluating. Anything Duke told him from that point forward was protected by doctor-patient privilege. The case, the only case, the one that mattered, was effectively closed before it had properly opened. Tyerla's family sued for wrongful death. They won. They were initially awarded a substantial settlement, but with the assistance of Duke's legal team, that sum was subsequently reduced. By the time the matter was fully resolved, 5 years after Tyerla's death, a court found Duke negligent, and the family received a settlement equivalent to roughly $580,000 in today's money, divided among Tyerla's 8 surviving siblings. For the woman whose net worth would eventually be measured in the billions, it was a sum that barely registered. For the Tyerla family, it was the only acknowledgement they would ever receive that something had gone deeply wrong. The case went quiet. Decades passed. The official story, a tragic accident, a foot that slipped from brake to gas, calcified into history, repeated without challenge in biography after biography, obituary after obituary. Then, in 2020, a journalist named Peter Lance, a Newport native who had begun his career at the Newport Daily News in the years just after Tyerla's death, decided to look again. What he found should unsettle anyone who has ever assumed that wealth and justice operate independently of one another. The original police file on the case was missing from the archives where it should have been kept. The transcripts from the wrongful death lawsuit, the sworn testimony, the evidence presented at trial were gone as well. Lance eventually managed to recover portions of both, piecing together a record that had, by every appearance, been quietly allowed to disappear. What that record showed was this: Duke's own account of the incident had shifted over time, in ways inconsistent with the physical evidence. The parking brake, according to mechanical analysis, could not have disengaged the way she described. And critically, every one of Tyrla's injuries was located above his waist. Above the waist. If Tyrla had truly been pinned between a slow-rolling car and a wrought iron gate, as Duke's account suggested, the physics of that collision would have produced very different injuries: lower body trauma, crushing injuries consistent with a body caught and compressed between two stationary objects. Injuries concentrated above the waist suggest something else entirely. A body struck while standing, the force of impact throwing him up and over the hood of a vehicle moving, with considerably more speed and intent than an accidental, creeping roll toward an open gate. There was more. The tire tracks left in the gravel by the Polara's rear wheels were deep, far deeper than what would be expected from an accidental, momentary depression of the gas pedal by someone genuinely trying to find the brake. Several experts who reviewed the evidence at Lance's request, including Lance himself, reached the same unsettling conclusion: that the physical evidence was more consistent with a deliberate act than an accident. That Doris Duke, in a state of rage over Tyrla's decision to leave her, to choose Hollywood, to choose his own future, over a decade spent curating hers, had driven directly at him outside the gates, thrown him over the hood of the car, and then driven over his body as he lay in the road. No one can say this with absolute certainty. Lance's investigation does not amount to a conviction. It amounts to a deeply troubling re-examination of evidence that was, by every indication, never properly tested in the first place. But the pattern that emerges, the conveniently hired medical examiner, the vanished police file, the missing trial transcripts, the swiftly closed investigation, does not describe the behavior of institutions confident in an innocent explanation. It describes the behavior of institutions that had already decided, before any real inquiry began, whose version of events would prevail. And here is the detail that makes the story almost unbearable to sit with. Shortly after the case was closed, Doris Duke began making substantial philanthropic contributions to the city of Newport. She funded repairs to the cliff walk that ran along her estate, the same cliff walk that had previously been a point of friction with the town, after her dogs had attacked tourists there. She gave $10,000 to the hospital where Tyrla had been pronounced dead. Within months, she established the Newport Restoration Foundation, the organization that would go on to save 84 of the city's colonial-era buildings, a genuine, lasting, architecturally significant gift to American historical preservation. The police chief who oversaw the original investigation retired to Florida within the year and purchased 2 condominiums. He was succeeded not by the officer next in line for the position, but by the very detective who had investigated Tyrla's death. In Newport, the belief persists to this day, quietly, but persistently, that what followed Eduardo Tyrla's death was not simply grief transformed into generosity. It was something closer to payment, a debt settled not through justice, but through money, the only currency Doris Duke had ever fully trusted to make a problem disappear. The locals have a name for it, spoken less often now, but never entirely forgotten. Blood money. Doris Duke lived another 27 years after Eduardo Tyrla's death, and in that time she became, by almost any measure, one of the great philanthropists of the 20th century. She funded AIDS research at Duke University in the late 1980s, when the disease still carried a stigma that kept far wealthier institutions from associating themselves with it publicly. She poured resources into child welfare programs. She funded the construction of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's ashram in India in 1963, the very ashram that would, 5 years later, become globally famous when the Beatles arrived to study there. She quietly funded the education of Black students in the American South who had been disadvantaged by segregation and structural racism, a cause she pursued without the fanfare that accompanied her more visible architectural philanthropy. She continued building. Duke Gardens, the sprawling indoor botanical display at Duke Farms, grew into one of the largest of its kind in the country, 11 interconnected recreations of garden traditions from around the world, built in part with Doris's own hands during 16-hour workdays. She climbed scaffolding herself, well into her later years, to clean the tile murals at Shangri-La in 1988, At the age of 75, she did something that startled even the people closest to her. She legally adopted a 35-year-old Hare Krishna devotee named Shandy Hefner, a woman who, for a time, Duke insisted was the literal reincarnation of Arden, the daughter she had lost in 1940, 48 years earlier. It is difficult to read that detail without returning to the beginning of this story, to a 12-year-old girl who learned that money could win a lawsuit but could not buy back trust, and a young mother who lost her only child a day after birth. Whatever Doris Duke's external life looked like, the surfing, the jazz, the gardens, the gowns, there is a thread running underneath all of it that speaks of a woman trying, again and again, across 6 decades, to fill a space that nothing material was ever going to fill. The adoption of Shandy Hefner ended, like so much in Duke's life, in rupture. The two women had a bitter falling out, and in the final version of her will, Duke explicitly excluded Hefner from her trust funds and moved to negate the adoption entirely. In 1992, at 79 years old, Duke underwent a facelift. While still heavily medicated during recovery, she attempted to walk, fell, and broke her hip. The following January, she underwent knee replacement surgery, was hospitalized for over 2 months, and then underwent a second knee surgery that July. A day after returning home from that second surgery, she suffered a severe stroke. Doris Duke died at Falcon Lair, her Los Angeles estate, on October 28, 1993. She was 80 years old. She was cremated within 24 hours of her death, unusually fast, a detail that would later fuel speculation, and her ashes were scattered into the Pacific Ocean by her executor, a former butler named Bernard Lafferty, exactly as her will instructed. What followed was one of the most contentious estate battles in American history. Duke's final will left the overwhelming majority of her fortune, estimated at the time at $1.2 billion, to a network of charitable foundations. She named Lafferty, her butler, as executor. Almost immediately, the will was challenged. A nurse named Tammy Payette alleged that Lafferty and a prominent Beverly Hills physician had conspired to hasten Duke's death using morphine and Demerol. In 1996, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office reviewed the allegations and found no firm evidence of foul play. A separate lawsuit, brought by a man named Harry Demopoulos, who had been named executor in an earlier version of Duke's will, argued that Lafferty and his lawyers had manipulated a sick, heavily sedated, elderly woman into rewriting her wishes in his favor. Duke University itself sued, claiming entitlement to a far larger share of the estate than the $10 million allotted to it. The litigation that followed consumed nearly 3 years and involved 40 lawyers across 10 law firms. New York courts ultimately removed Lafferty as executor, finding he had used estate funds for his own personal support, and found that U.S. Trust, the corporate co-executor, had failed to do anything to stop him. In 1996, the Surrogates Court of Manhattan took the extraordinary step of overriding Duke's chosen arrangement entirely, appointing new trustees drawn largely from the very people who had challenged the will in the first place. The fees for the legal battle exceeded $10 million, paid out of the estate itself. Even Duke's most carefully constructed philanthropic legacies did not escape unscathed. The new trustees of the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation progressively reduced funding for the foundations managing her 3 great estates, Shangri-La, Rough Point, and Duke Farms, at one point characterizing her personal projects as perpetuating the Duke family history of personal passions and conspicuous consumption. Duke Gardens, the 60,000-square-foot botanical display she had built with her own hands, was closed permanently in 2008. In 2004, Christie's auctioned off the Doris Duke collection over 3 days in New York City, the proceeds benefiting her charitable foundation. The contents of a life's worth of acquisition, cataloged across more than 600 illustrated pages and dispersed, item by item, to bidders who had never known her at all. There is a version of this story that ends with admiration. Doris Duke, after all, gave away more money to more worthy causes than almost any private individual in American history. AIDS research before it was fashionable to fund it. The education of students failed by a racist system. 84 historic buildings saved from demolition. a botanical garden that brought the wonders of a dozen countries to a quiet corner of New Jersey. These are not small things, they are not gestures. They changed lives, and in some cases they are still changing lives today, decades after her death. There is another version of this story that ends with horror. A man is dead. The investigation into his death was compromised before it had properly begun. The evidence, when finally examined by someone willing to look, points toward something far more deliberate than the story that was allowed to stand for 50 years. And in the months that followed his death, the woman responsible began writing checks to the hospital, to the town, to the very cliff walk that bordered the estate where it happened, checks that either were, or were not, an attempt to purchase the silence that wealth has always been capable of purchasing. The uncomfortable truth this story asks us to sit with is that both of these versions are correct. Simultaneously, without contradiction, Doris Duke was not a monster who occasionally did good. She was not a saint with one terrible lapse. She was something far more difficult for us to categorize. A woman whose capacity for genuine, world-altering generosity and whose capacity for catastrophic, possibly murderous rage appear to have come from the exact same source. The same restless, all-consuming intensity that drove her to climb scaffolding at 70 to clean tile murals with her own hands. That drove her to fund an ashram in rural India a full 5 years before the Beatles made it famous. That drove her to marry a Dominican diplomat and write off $1 million to clear the way. That same intensity, turned against a man who chose to leave her, may have driven a car forward with lethal force. We like our stories to resolve. We like our heiresses to be either tragic victims, undone by people who exploited their isolation, or villains, undone by their own corruption. Huguette Clark's story, in its way, resolves toward tragedy, a woman exploited by the very people paid to protect her. Doris Duke's story refuses that resolution entirely. She was not the victim in the Tyler case. By every available reading of the evidence, she may well have been the perpetrator. And then, she used the very fortune that made her untouchable to ensure she would never have to answer for it. And perhaps that is the deeper truth this story is reaching for. Not that money corrupts, that lesson is too simple, too easily nodded along to and then forgotten. The deeper truth is this: extreme wealth does not just buy houses and gardens and private airplanes. It buys narrative. It buys which version of events becomes history. It buys the silence of a medical examiner, the disappearance of a police file, the early retirement of a police chief into 2 Florida condominiums. It buys, ultimately, the right to be remembered as a philanthropist rather than investigated as a suspect. Doris Duke spent the final 27 years of her life building gardens, saving buildings, funding cures, adopting daughters to replace the one she lost, constructing, brick by brick and dollar by dollar, an external world so beautiful and so generous that almost no one thought to look too closely at the gravel drive outside the gates of Rough Point. It nearly worked completely. For 54 years, it did. What finally cracked it open was not a confession. It was not a deathbed admission or a court of law or a reckoning of conscience. It was a journalist, decades later, simply asking where the paperwork had gone and discovering that someone, a very long time ago, had made sure it would never be found. The richest woman in America did not escape her tragic secret by burying it. She escaped it by making sure no one was left who could afford to keep looking.